Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is human biology and we are on the psychology unit. So in this unit we are going to be studying, as you will know from Crash Course, the mind and the study of mental processes. We're actually going to be studying some applied psychology for a couple of reasons. One, I find it quite interesting compared to more traditional routes of studying psychology. And two, I think that if you were to take a college level intro to psychology with good reading skills and study skills and writing paper skills, you will be able to do just fine and keep up with no worries. So a more traditional study of psychology would probably involve what our crash course for number 1, Intro to Psychology, would cover more of the history and the different schools of psychology. But us, what are we going to study? We're going to be studying the brain. As you're going to hear several times, everything psychological is physical. We're going to be applying what we learn from the brain about love, relationships, and sex. We're going to be applying what we learn about the brain to mental health and to our personalities. Okay, so let's get started on the brain. So you didn't have to write this stuff down, but do please write this down. The biological basis of psychology. So the nervous system, we have previously learned about the nervous system, and it can be grouped into a couple of categories. The brain, which we know is part of the central nervous system. We're going to be talking about neurotransmitters, which we have already talked about during the nervous system. And we know that the neurotransmitters are considered your fast system of delivery. Whereas the endocrine system, with all of its glands and hormones, and I hope you can still remember your gland and some of its hormones, it is considered a slow system. It takes a lot longer to respond, and those effects will take longer. Okay, as you're going to hear several times, everything psychological is biological. So looking at a crash course, The Brain and the Chemical Mind, we're going to get a little preview of the crash course, which is actually a review of the neuron. Okay, we're going to have Hank Green take it away for about a minute or so.
Transmit signals either when stimulated by sensory input or triggered by neighboring neurons. The dendrites pick up the signal and activate the neuron's action potential or firing impulse that shoots an electrical charge down the axon to its terminals and toward the neighboring neurons. The contact points between neurons are called synapses. All those bushy little dendrites are decorated with synapses that almost, but don't quite touch the neighboring axon in the tiniest game of "I'm not touching you" of all time. They're less than a millionth of an inch apart, and that microscopic cleft is called the synaptic gap. So when an action potential runs down to the end of an axon, it activates the chemical messengers that jump that tiny synaptic gap, flying like that little air kiss and landing on the receptor sites of the receiving neuron. Those messengers are neurotransmitters. Although neurotransmitters slide right into their intended receptors like a key into a lock, they don't stay bonded to the receiving neuron. They just sort of pop out, having excited or inhibited the receiving neuron's trigger, then the extras immediately get reabsorbed by the neuron that released them in the first place, in a process called reuptake. Kind of like, here you go, say. So neurons communicate with neurotransmitters, which in turn cause motion and emotion. They help us move around, make jazz hands, learn, feel, remember, stay alert, get sleepy, and pretty much do everything we do. Some of them just make you feel good, like the endorphins we get flooded with after running 10 miles or falling in love or eating a really good piece of pie. We've got over 100 different kinds of these brilliant neurotransmitters. Some are excitatory and others are inhibitory, and all are good reminders that everything psychological is also biological. Excitatory.
Okay, hopefully a lot of that was review about the neuron. And we're going to do a nervous system review. As we talked about, the brain, the nervous system is broken up into the central nervous system with the brain and the spinal cord, and then also the peripheral nervous system, which includes all of the nerves and all of your sensory receptors. the peripheral nervous system can be broken up into two more types: the somatic nervous system, which its primary function is to regulate the actions of the skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which regulates primarily your involuntary activities such as heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, and digestion. The autonomic peripheral nervous system is also broken up into two parts: sympathetic and parasympathetic. And a question is, which one will rev you up and which one slows you down? Okay, after our review of the brain and the nervous system, let's talk more about neurotransmitters and their behavior. As you should remember from our nervous system, neurotransmitters are chemical messengers between neurons. And there are excitatory neurotransmitters, which will make it more likely that the neuron will fire. And if you remember from Hank Green, neurotransmitters are those little chemicals that jump between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another. And inhibitory neurotransmitters are the opposite of excitatory. They make it less likely that a neuron will fire. Okay, we're going to talk about some different neurotransmitters. The first one I want to talk about is acetylcholine. And acetylcholine controls voluntary movement. It also contributes to the regulation of arousal and memory. So in this case, arousal only means awake versus asleep. So too little acetylcholine is actually associated with Alzheimer's disease, and too much is associated with depression. So you need just the right amount of acetylcholine for everything to work just right. So again, just to review, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. It's one of those chemical messengers between the between the axon of one neuron to the dendrite of another, and it crosses that synaptic cleft. And if you remember from our muscle unit, acetylcholine is very important in the skeletal muscles, controls voluntary movement, and it has other jobs also. The second neurotransmitter I would like to talk about is dopamine. Dopamine also controls voluntary movement, and it is involved in your reward pathway. So when you eat a piece of chocolate, you get a little shot of dopamine, and it tells you that it liked that and it would like you to eat more chocolate. So either too much or too little of dopamine will also cause disorders. Parkinson's is involved with dopamine neurotransmitter. Schizophrenia is also involved in the dopamine neurotransmitter, and addictive disorders, perhaps being addicted to drugs or alcohol, are involved with some dysregulation with the dopamine neurotransmitter or pathways. Okay, so the third neurotransmitter I'd like to talk about is norepinephrine. And this neurotransmitter is involved in regulating mood and arousal, again, awake and asleep cycles. And a dysregulation in norepinephrine can lead to depression. And a fourth neurotransmitter is serotonin, and perhaps you've heard of this one. It's a little bit more famous. It is involved in the regulation of sleep and arousal. As you can see, a lot of neurotransmitters are involved in that. Also in eating and aggression. So if you have not enough or too little serotonin, not enough or too much serotonin, there are some disorders that are associated with that: depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and eating disorders. So Prozac is a famous medication, a famous antidepressive, and it's one of many SSRIs, which stand for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And these medications, these anxiolytics used for anxiety or antidepressants used for depression, work on serotonin receptors. So a reuptake means that the serotonin has been released from your body, and then it gets taken back up to be used again. So if you have low levels, you kind of want to stop all that reuptake. You want to inhibit the reuptake so you have more serotonin just floating around in your brain. So SSRIs work by inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin, so you have more serotonin just kind of floating around in your brain. So our brain likes serotonin. It makes us feel happy. So many illegal drugs like amphetamines and cocaine affect your dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin synapses. So this is one of many reasons not to do drugs, because an illegal drug like a shot of cocaine has a big spike in all of those dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, and you feel really good, but it's not sustainable, and then you crash, and it actually makes your body less susceptible to getting those nice high feelings from everyday life. So you're actually kind of like hindering your body's ability to feel good in a normal way just by like eating some chocolate or going for a walk or talking to a friend or something like that. So one of many reasons not to do drugs is that they mess up your good feeling neurotransmitters. Okay, GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it also works with your sleep and arousal cycles. And inhibitory means it will make it less likely when this neurotransmitter is around. It makes it less likely that those neurons are going to fire. Disorders associated with abnormal amounts of GABA are anxiety, and Valium, which is a pretty famous medication, an older medication, works on GABA synapses. Our sixth neurotransmitter we're going to talk about are endorphins. These moderate pain and are involved in stress, the stress response. So opiates are medicines or drugs that mimic endorphins, and they moderate pain. And so they can be useful in the medical community for pain relief. And also, as you've heard with the opioid crisis, they can cause a lot of problems. Some things that would be in that category, fentanyl, Vicodin, morphine, and Oxycontin. And they do create a dependency, and it makes it harder for your natural endorphins to feel as good. Okay, I think we're going to pause there for today. We learned the overview of the nervous system. We did a review of the nervous system and neurons and neurotransmitters. And then we went in depth about several different neurotransmitters and their jobs. Tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the brain, different parts of the brain, and your behavior. Okay, see you then. Bye.